Welcome everyone to Fairtrade USA's webinar on the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on fair trade communities and supply chains. My name is Emily Hobbs and I manage corporate philanthropic partnerships at Fairtrade USA. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, Fairtrade USA conducted two surveys, one in April and one in July, with Fairtrade farms, fisheries, and factories around the world. We wanted to record this webinar today to review the results and discuss the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in different regions around the world. This is one of two webinars that we will be recording. This webinar will be focused on apparel and home goods supply chains, and our other webinar will be focused on food and beverage supply chains. For this webinar, we will review the data in the aggregate and then have a deeper discussion on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in two regions, in India and Latin America, because we're joined today with two of our field staff with expertise in those regions. I'm now going to ask the team to introduce themselves, and we can start with Sumita.
Hi everyone, my name is Sumita Sharma and I am the Apparel and Home Goods Field Manager for India. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Brenda Hernandez and I am the Home Good Apparel Field Staff Manager at Latin America region.
Great. My name is Ashley Graham. I'm a Senior Brand Partnerships Manager at Fairtrade USA, working specifically in the Apparel and Home Goods program.
Great. And my name is Priyanka Amin. I work on our Impact Research and Learning team on our data and analysis.
Great, thank you all and welcome. And Priyanka, I'll now ask that you take things over and walk us through the high-level data.
Great. So thanks for that introduction, Emily. I'll be sharing results from our survey at a high level and then breaking them down by the apparel and home goods sector. So for context, as Emily mentioned, we launched two surveys, one in mid-April and one in mid-July. We surveyed 126 fair trade organizations across 27 countries. In both months, we received leading responses from fair trade farms, factories, fisheries, and cooperatives in India and Mexico. And both surveys had similar breakdowns in terms of our representation across our supply chain. So we have a roughly 56 to 59% factory representation, a third of agriculture, and just below 10% for seafood. So looking at our fair trade certified organizations and beneficiaries, so our farmers, workers, and fishers, we see that they've really adapted their way of life and working drastically to meet the moment. Government safety restrictions are in place across all supply chains in countries, which include social distancing, school closures, and restricted travel, both for the public and for commercial goods. Similarly, fair trade certified organizations have had to adapt operations to keep everyone safe. So over 90% are implementing the first three measures you see listed here: extra hygiene such as hand washing, taking temperatures, educating their workforces. Back in April when we surveyed, we saw that 80% of organizations were implementing some sort of at least 4 of these measures or more, compared to 95% of the organizations, nearly all of the organizations surveyed in July. Looking at some other changes we've seen between April and July, we see a really big decrease in those reporting decreases in demand. So see decrease in demand starting to drop. In April, 2/3 reported dips in demand since the outbreak versus 55% in mid-July since the last survey. There's a small uptick in demand primarily seen across our produce organizations. What's clear is that these government safety restrictions and reduced demand really funnel into two large challenges for farmers, workers, and fishers alike. So government safety measures around travel, which include restricted travel in country and lack of public transport, have really been felt across these supply chains and especially pose risk to migrant factory and farm workers who are unable to return back to work. Additionally, smallholder farmers lack the requisite facilities to move their product and workers cannot reach these small farms to harvest. And then given these transportation issues, coupled with that decrease in demand we saw, there's less work and then less income in general. This creates some concern around money being sent back to home communities and ability to afford food, exacerbated by other household job losses. And then lastly, there's general concern around access to medical attention and healthcare if COVID is contracted. Lack of COVID testing and sufficient PPE also pose challenges to preventing the spread in home communities beyond the workplace. But encouragingly, we see fair trade premium, which is the money that is sent back to farmers, fishers, and workers to democratically spend, has been made available to address these emergency needs. And 77% of the fair trade committees at these organizations have spent or have concrete plans to spend this premium to address challenges. And overwhelmingly, these groups plan to spend or have already spent these funds on food items or cash distributions to meet basic needs and supplement lost income. So switching gears and looking closer at our apparel and home goods factory supply chains, we see that 88% of the factories that we surveyed are operating under their full production capacity. And in many cases, they're doing so with less workers compared to the same time last year. The reason for this it's twofold. Really starting first, we know that factories were definitely disproportionately affected by mandated government shutdowns, especially in places like India and Sri Lanka. 50% of the factories surveyed report having shut down production at some point during the pandemic, compared to only 11% of agriculture organizations and 29% of seafood organizations. And those organizations across agriculture mainly shut down briefly and voluntary for cleaning, versus a lot of the factories that shut down overwhelmingly shut down because they were mandated to do so by the government. And of all of the factories that shut down, only 4% are operating at 100% of their production capacity, compared to 20% of the factories that report never shutting down. When we look at the workforce employment by that shut down production, we can see that 28% of the factories that never shut down their production have 100% of their workforces back employed, versus only 8% of those factories that did shut down. And we heard about the transportation challenges that are impacting migrant workers and their ability to return to work. So some of the reduced production capacity can be explained by these shutdowns and the resulting labor shortages. And shutdowns explain part of the issue for this reduced production capacity, but it's also clear that dropping demand and canceled and delayed orders continue to affect the supply chain recovery. So in April, we saw 85% of factories reporting decreased demand since the outbreak. It's positive to see fewer factories are reporting decreases in July, but it's still 2/3 of the ones surveyed. And the remainder predominantly show no change in demand. In April, we also asked about anticipated challenges due to the virus. And while a fewer percent of factories actually report experiencing the challenges they anticipated, we still see 2/3 experiencing some sort of canceled or delayed order since mid-April. So this combination of declining demand, delayed orders, and shutdowns are likely the key drivers of reduced production capacity. It's worthwhile to note there are regional differences at play. So a larger percent of our certificate holders and our factories in Southeast Asia are up to 100% of their workforce employed and production capacity than those in South Asia. So we can see that this difference in production capacity and workforce employment is likely a result of COVID just affecting Southeast Asian regions earlier, and the situation is improving faster. And then additionally, a majority of the factories that shut down were in South Asia, as I mentioned, particularly India and Sri Lanka, about 75%. So migrant labor shortage issues might be affecting these regions more. But regardless of these regional differences in ramping back up production and recovery, factories across the board are dealing with operational challenges due to COVID. We see that 94% of factories have experienced either a canceled order or delayed order or day-to-day cash flow issues since mid-April. And in response, we see factories turning to business continuity plans, with 50% beginning to craft long-term solutions to address and alleviate the challenges of COVID. And already seeing a third of these factories switching their production to protective equipment, medical apparel, goods with more demand. Great, I'll turn it back over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Priyanka, for walking us through that. So you've spent a lot of time with this data. What do you think is the most compelling takeaway that you think it's really important for people to understand?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that in April, we saw huge numbers reporting drops in demand, full shutdowns, just responding, orders being delayed, a lot of anxiety. So now having the second pulse in July, realizing that factories are starting to recover, production is starting to ramp back up. It's not 100% and there are still challenges, but knowing that fair trade premium can help reduce and alleviate a lot of the challenges workers are experiencing due to COVID. So I think that was really the large takeaway, showing how our fair trade premium can really help address some of these basic needs that are arising.
Great. Thanks, Priyanka. It's an important finding. I want to pivot to Sumita and Brenda, and I want to bring us back to March and April. What were some of the first challenges that you saw in your supply chains? And let's start with Sumita and then go to Brenda.
Sure, thanks, Emily. For India, I would like to share a few challenges which were seen during the month of March and April. First being the migrant worker crisis, because the first lockdown was an abrupt announcement to everyone. So the workers who were working in South India couldn't go back to North India because the interstate borders were closed and there was lack of transportation facilities to travel for workers who were stranded in different states. Secondly, as Priyanka's finding says, that there was definitely cancelled, reduced and delayed orders, which significantly affected the production capacity and also have reduced the income of workers, and also in a way has kept the shipment on hold, as well as some of the shipments were delayed. And thirdly, as a temporary challenge, because most of these orders were cancelled or delayed, some of the factories, I would say a handful of factories, could take the opportunity to divert their business to manufacturing PPE kits, because that was a high demand, not only domestic market, but also in the international market. Thank you.
In Latin America, we have several and different countries that apply different measures. And in those ways, factories that are within our program were impacted. In El Salvador, for instance, we had a general mandatory lockdown that was over a month. And that really impacted the capacity of the production in that factory at the beginning of March and April. That was really very complicated, as well as in Colombia, which had to be overcome by factories having to manage their orders and production through a distribution of work towards this distance patterns. And some of the factories, like in Colombia, they don't depend too much on fabric coming from abroad because they produce some of the fabric there. So it was really an advantage at that point, but still the orders were dramatically reduced, and that definitely produced an impact in the processes that they had. In comparison to Nicaragua, where nothing happened at the governmental level, and no measures were taken at a governmental level, it was the factory, the one that had to overcome the risk by implementing extreme measures within the factory to ensure that workers would be safe at that point, because they never stopped. And that was a challenge by itself. So this is from basically the human perspective. In terms of business, well, we've seen the statistics already, so that's what basically we've been accompanying through the program.
Thank you both. I have a follow-up question. Now that we are in August, can you tell us what is happening both at the country level and then at the operational level in the factories? And Brenda, this time, can we start with you?
Yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, they had this, in some countries, the mandatory lockdowns and transportation restrictions. Most of the factories had to implement their own transportation systems to ensure that workers could come back, because although they were allowed to restart production, the transportation systems that are publicly managed were not in place. So factories had to realize a way to ensure that their workers could come. And for instance, in El Salvador, they cannot reach all the towns where workers are located with the transportation means that they were able to find. So having workers in the factory means that they're not really at this point operating to 100% of their capacity. They're close to 90%, I would say. In Mexico, they have in each one of the towns around the factory, they have their own sanitary restrictions. So the transportation systems have to comply with each one of the towns that they have to pass by. So the challenges are really hard to describe in this little amount of time, by trying to provide an idea of what factors have to come about to ensure both workers' safety and complying with governmental restrictions in order to be able to provide a service to their customers.
Thank you, Brenda. Sumita, the same question for you about the context, both with factories and in country, now that we're in August.
Yeah, for as far as the country level is concerned, India is definitely restarting to get back to normal, except the educational institutions like colleges and schools. At factory level, the factory management is definitely trying their best to recover the loss which they have been facing in the past few months. They are struggling to also maintain the health protocols which has been mandated by the government, because now the responsibilities have become higher for the factories to keep a safe environment for the workers. Not all the workers, not 100% workers have come back, returned to work, but there has been significant delays also in on the on-site audits, not only for fair trade but for other like brands as well, because of this increasing infection rate in our country presently.
Thank you. Thank you both for those answers and context. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the Fair Trade USA program and hear from both of you. And let's start with you, Sumita. What are some of the ways that Fair Trade has been able to support factories and workers since the outbreak of the pandemic?
Yeah. So because of this global crisis, as you know, the livelihoods were being affected and people were searching ways to support their families. Fairtrade USA prioritized to support the factory partners as well as the workers by introducing a policy on premium COVID use again for the COVID-19 response. This was a policy specially designed where generally whenever a project is implemented, before implementing a project, the General Assembly of Workers have to approve that project. But because of the lockdown and shutdowns, because the factories were closed, this policy allowed the Fair Trade Committee to remotely over telephonic calls, decide on how to use the premium fund in any emergency or essential need. That said, this particular policy was highly appreciated not only by factory partners but also by the workers because it really helped them with to meet certain needs such as school fees, the house rents, medical supplies as well as food because anyway most of the workers had reduced income in those particular months when the lockdowns were happening in our country. So this policy was of great support from Fairtrade USA when it was introduced in the month of April, early April. Thank you.
In the case of Latin America, we were able to provide specific support given the incredible impact that the reduction of orders had in factories. We were we had to accompany one factory that ended up closing and needing to become decertified. But in this process, our policy for COVID-19 emergency was crucial in allowing the money of the funds to be distributed equally among all workers and provide an additional aid for workers that were being left without any income after 2 months of their closure. Besides that, in other factories that have also had this impact, we have been providing support with specific benchmarks and policies that allow factory to ensure compliance and proper addressing of how to go about retrenchment in this particular crisis. In that sense, also using this approach of redirecting the funds towards the relief of the impact of the pandemic in the sense of ensuring a vision of sustainability. In the case of one of the factories in Mexico, we're working with a particular project of training workers in gardens, vegetable gardening at their own homes. And that we see as a very positive result of our program implementation in that country. In El Salvador, we were able to use this policy to allow workers that were not being able to come to the factory to receive food baskets, and also in the factory in Mexico, beside food baskets, cleaning supplies that would allow them to support their hygiene practices for prevention in this context.
Just to add to what Brenda has said, this policy for the first time actually allowed cash payout. I mean, a bank transfer was allowed to the workers' bank accounts, and that way the workers, the migrant workers, could also send back money to their home states. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for sharing those examples of the impact of the Fair Trade USA program and especially premium over the last few months on the lives of workers and for the factories. I would love to shift now to you, Ashley, and hear from your perspective on what's going on in the industry and if you can speak to decreased demand that we're seeing at the factory level.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. I wanted to take us back to March. It wasn't that long ago, though it sometimes feels like it. In the US, we had regional-based closure. So I sit in New York City, where we had a pretty rough go of it with COVID-19. But what we saw was regionally folks were choosing whether or not to close down. And we saw brands having to decide for themselves what they wanted to do and how they wanted to approach protecting their workforces in the US and their customers. So we saw brands starting one by one to close their retail locations, in some cases close their distribution store, their distribution channels. And it has been a major challenge for brands, not only with the closure of the stores, but the general economic uncertainty during these months. Product is developed and ordered way before it gets to the customer. In our industry, sometimes as long as 6 to 9 months prior to being on shelves. Sometimes it's quicker, but often it's about that time frame. So in this chunk of time, products are manufactured, exported, imported, distribution to the different stores around the country. So when there was a sharp decrease in demand in March, the product had been planned way differently. We thought we were going to be in a whole different world. So what was a result was brands were sitting on a lot of excess inventory that they weren't able to sell. And the season that would follow, so that was spring, the seasons that would follow the summer and fall were already in order or in production. So brands had to figure out what they were going to do with that inventory. What we see in the survey results and talking to our industry partners is that we're going to continue to see a reduction of volume for upcoming seasons because of this excess inventory. So we expect that the impacts of the crisis will ripple through the supply chain for a while.
Thanks, Ashley. How about your brand partners? I know that you work really closely with fair trade brands, and what are you hearing from them, and especially from a macro trend perspective?
Yeah, so we work with about 50 brand partners, but we're also part of industry organizations where we're talking to our industry at a broader level. So as I mentioned before, just to sort of hit on the macro trends, we saw the closure of retail being really damaging for sales and business at apparel and home goods retailers. What we expect to see is that this crisis really dramatically changed the way brands and factories interact with each other. I think it's been really clear, even more clear than it was before, how interdependent these folks are on one another. At a macro level, so greater than fair trade, what we saw was some brands have a knee-jerk reaction to cancel and postpone orders in March and April to try to stay afloat. And we've seen largely that these folks and these brands have been pressured to fulfill those commitments to their factory partners. And then we've seen sort of the other side where some brands have been more flexible on timelines and other requirements to help their suppliers make it through this crisis. One interesting thing I think it is to note is that often factories sell to multiple brands. So it's been really clear to factory partners who is in it sort of for a true partnership and who sort of had a knee-jerk reaction to and not approach the relationship in a sustainable manner. From Fair Trade USA side, our partners have been consistently and constantly asking us about their factory partners, and also asking them straight up, like, what can we do to help? We've had some brands reach out and send additional fair trade premium to their factories, and those factory workers were able to leverage those additional funds in a similar manner to what Samita was discussing previous. Something else promising that we've seen is a slight uptick in inquiries from new brands. So brands seeing what has happened through COVID-19 crisis and understanding that they really want to have a deep partnership with their suppliers. And the Fair Trade program is one way to deepen your relationship with not only your factory partners, but really the workers that make your product. Overall, I would say in the short term, what we're seeing is a contraction of the industry. Many brands and retailers have filed for bankruptcy. You'll see it in the news quite often in the US, and many factories may shut down. We've seen that happen in Mexico, which Brenda mentioned. And so this means that many workers around the world may be out of work. And we do anticipate a tough period before things level off. But I have hope, and why I do the work that I do is that we can build the industry back to be more equitable and more resilient going forward.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing that broad industry perspective. We have one final question, so I want to turn back to Sumita and Brenda now. And this is something that we hear all the time and are asked: what can brands and consumers do to support factory workers right now? And Sumita, I will start with you.
Well, I feel this is the time when we can say seek the seal of fair trade, because the fair trade orders has a lot of, it's like connected to the premium. So if more brands or more buyers sign up for the fair trade certified products, then the premium, it's in a way supporting the workers and giving them an extra support in this pandemic time. And this is what I would say from my side. And also in a way, creating consumer awareness towards buying fair trade products at this time. Yeah.
I think it's important that the brand understands that the factories themselves have been sort of almost having to face this huge challenge without feeling, sometimes a very important support from their own governments. So I think brands can leverage at that space there. Brands can demand governments to ensure that they implement the measures at the state level that would allow healthy economies to be sustainable in this not developed or underdeveloped countries. That is crucial. And the importance of ensuring that social security access is guaranteed for workers' safety. That is something that factories could not directly control because they depended on the outside. This is like a time where we know that the power that corporations have can impact positively in ensuring that at the state level, workers are provided with the safety they need as human beings.
Thank you, Brenda. That's a great note to end on. I want to thank you all for participating and for your tireless work to support our stakeholders, brands, factories, consumers since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for those who tuned in, if you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to us at info@fairtradeusa.org. Thank you.